Chapter 12. Gideon's Semblance. Gideon felt uneasy as he entered combat. As familiar as it was to him, he couldn't make the smooth transition from awareness of a threat to engaging it, no matter how many times they practiced in training. The moment the dust started roaring past him, he was as afraid as anyone else would be, knowing that someone else had the intent and ability to kill you. He moved closer to Havilah as she gathered herself from what he assumed was shock. A hand briefly reached out to console her, but decided better of it. This was the kind of person she was. Faunus or not, she was still human and needed to work through her emotions on her own time. The moment her head rose and her tail relaxed, he knew they were ready to move. He followed her as best he could, but found that losing restraint came easier to her than others. He kept his eyes as focused as he could, yet couldn't resist a smirk when rocks began to fall as a result of her showing off her acrobatic skills as they closed in. Maneuver 2, maneuver 2. You know this. Stay focused, Gideon repeated to himself. The gesture was fruitless. If it wasn't for the constant repetition of what those words meant being ingrained into his muscles, nothing he could tell himself would be able to call himself back from sheer panic. It was refreshing, at least, to know fear. It reminded him that he was at least aware of himself. That had become a luxury in these kind of situations. The moment he closed the gap and was able to engage those who attacked his home and friends, there was only one thing he could do, and he didn't want to do it. Daniel's roar of pain pulled his senses back to the moment as his instincts kicked in. Havilah had already disabled the weapons of 2 of them, and she was about 10 paces from his first opponent. Rather than risk another episode, he chose instead to hold on to his clarity by moving to support his wounded friend. His skin would be pristine, of course. No burn wounds or trauma would exist on his body that he needed to treat. He'd just need someone to distract those shooting at him so that he could gather himself. His sword arm ached from overuse, a form of self-sabotage he had gotten himself into should he run into the wrong kind of person. His drills and techniques worked again and again into his system, were meant to tire himself out. He told himself, and others, it was for mastery of the art, but he couldn't hide the truth from himself, at least not for much longer. He didn't want to be here. He hated what it meant to be here. His tortured psyche, already fatigued from the constant call of the blade, tore at his every last shred of self-discipline. Yet he still stood. His arm brought up at a wide angle to deflect the first ball of flame he came in contact with. He readied his stance and loosened his grip to allow for faster movement as their enemies now realized they were fighting a battle on 2 fronts. They didn't seem afraid. That worried him. That either meant they were insane or had something else in mind for them than what they could see. Neither sat well with him, but nothing ever did. He simply did what he could where he was and hoped it was where he needed to be. Olivia hadn't sent any signals to his scroll, so he assumed that was the case. Then again, it may just be appreciating the support he was providing to Daniel. The shadow of a smile played across his lips as the faint memory of their flirting gave a moment's distraction from his troubled and weary mind. Another shot came at him, his sword absorbed the energy, but the force pushed him half a pace back. Again and again, the fire concentrated itself on him, and his hard work began to pay off. There was no way he could think through what he was doing. He simply knew what to do because he had done it so many times before. The mental stress was only a distraction, and he heard faint laughter as he began to push it out of his mind. He couldn't afford the restraint. He needed to preserve himself. He needed to... The thought passed as quickly as it came when the fire abated. Havilah's shouts and blows continued to resound through the valley as she became a higher priority for their attention. All save for one, and a very big one at that. Standing over 2 meters tall, a very broad and bulky member of the group altered his cannon into a hammer and began to approach the 2 of them. He knew that looking at Daniel would only end up weakening him, so he kept his attention facing forward. Whoever this character was, he was very sure of himself. He could feel it reflecting back on him as he sized up a worthy challenge. He was covered head to toe in garments that resembled the rocks around him. On his neck dangled a collection of rocks that seemed ingrained into his flesh. These weren't a form of semblance of anything he could discern right away. They seemed ceremonious. Looking for weaknesses, he found none, as his best options for handling this enemy became fewer and fewer. He had farther reach, he was coming at them at a higher angle, and was highly motivated. Fortunately, his self-assurance bought him more time. Apparently, he felt the need to explain himself in a voice as abused as road gravel.
You will submit to the messenger of the mountain. His strength is the pinnacle. You will submit or be destroyed.
He certainly sounded convinced, and it seemed that Gideon's semblance only antagonized his self-confidence. When he wasn't given the response he wanted, he growled and began to charge. The sermonizing was amusing, but now a fight had started, and Gideon still wasn't sure why. He understood that his only chance was if he kept his distance, but the only reason he was where he stood was to protect Daniel. He braced himself and did everything he could not to look into the man's eyes. He brought down the hammer, and the ground around him sundered from the force. A ripple knocked him off his feet, and the only defense he had buckled. The man vaulted over his hammer and brought it to bear for a second blow. Still off balance, the only thing Gideon could do was allow himself to fall. The swing went wide as he rolled under it and felt the impulse of a weakness exposing itself, and the sword naturally began pulling itself towards the opening under his legs. A split decision moved the blade instead to cut where he expected there to be leg armor. He was angered, but they were both left superficially unharmed. "I'm not here to hurt you," Gideon yelled, pulling himself up from the ground. "Put down the weapon." The tone in his voice betrayed a concern for his enemy's life more than his own. Unperturbed, he backhanded the young man and sent him spiraling. Ignoring Daniel, he moved over and began hurling a flurry of curses as he kicked him on the ground. His arm was twitching, and every moment of impact became a battle, not against the pain, but against something far worse than anything inflicted on him. Memories flashed of those looking into his eyes and feeling pain, feeling fear, feeling the presence of a monster. What few understood about his semblance was that when they saw their own hearts in his eyes, his very soul was being replaced by their own. An image entered and left his mind that only desired one thing: destruction. He fought it off. He distanced himself as much as he could from the man's onslaught. He wouldn't give in. He wouldn't hurt anyone again. Blow after blow was endured until he was cornered and trapped between two rocks. He cried out in defiance, and for a moment it gave the man pause. This moment of respite almost allowed him a chance to get away, but the opportunity passed as quickly as it came. The man enveloped Gideon's throat and lifted him off the ground, drawing him close and looking for purchase on his bare neck. He resisted with the last he had to offer.
Don't make me do this."
The man smirked and smashed his head against the rock that had barred his escape and shattered the back of his visor. It slowly fell away to reveal Gideon's closed eyes and limp body. The sword remained in his hand, and the man looked down to examine how he could still hold on to it while unconscious. His eyes drew up to meet the boy's, to find them pure black and pouring forth what could only be described as smoke. Faster than the man's eyes could register, Gideon's blade severed his hand at the wrist and allowed himself to drop to the ground. Not gasping for air or even gathering himself, Gideon crouched as the man's hand still hung from his throat and thrust himself at the man. He stood in shock as a second hadn't even passed before he found himself bisected and passing from this world. His nervous system didn't go into shock, nor did the intent to kill even have a chance to pass from his heart into his need for self-preservation. At the speed of his own thoughts, Gideon pulverized what remained of the man with the blunt edge of his sword in total silence. Covered in blood and still with the man's hand on his throat, he surged on towards where he sensed activity. A predator's gait stalked forward, mirroring the way the man had just charged at him. He found another man stunned but still armed after Havaliah had brought her heel down between his shoulder blades. In an instant, the man's weapon that had been held in front of him was cut through along with the man's sternum. Reacting to the wound but too slowly to clutch it, the man died mid-scream as Gideon's blade re-entered the wound he had created in a fluid motion from the upward slash that had caused it. Smoke continued to pour from his eyes, and they fixed on a new target. Cruelty and the intent to kill emanated from him as heat would from a stove. Those that saw their comrade cut down began to reel in horror as this new threat revealed itself to them as life-threatening. None of them wanted to die, but their desires could not be more apparent, as their desires for their enemies had come to them in physical form. In one sweep of his blade, he dismembered one and decapitated the other, leaving the injured man to wallow in his misery. Gideon's black eyes searched for new prey as the hand still hung limply off his body. He turned to note the cries of the man whose arm hung off of him, almost by a sliver. A trail of blood followed him as Gideon followed suit, almost mimicking the first man he killed step for step. He grabbed the man's throat and slammed him into a nearby rock, and despite his youthful stature, easily hefted the overweight man who was now crying in his grip. A simple turn of his wrist broke the man's neck and allowed him to drop to the ground. The moment the massive sack of meat hit the ground, the hand finally slid from making direct contact with his skin, and the smoke abated from his eyes. Allowing himself to take in everything that had happened, water replaced the smoke as he wept over the man's corpse. Voiceless and empty, drops of water simply fell from his eyes as he observed his work. A rock nearby rolled over to reveal a death stalker, drawn in by the sheer despair being felt by Gideon at this moment. He didn't respond or regard the monster. His eyes simply closed and waited for the inevitable.